Welcome to Hardly. The book is condensed into a timeline story that fully presents all the key events, their causes, developments, and processes, helping you understand the original. Today, we study together Sudhir Venkatesh's gang leader for a day. A rogue sociologist takes to the streets, in which we probe into the unpredictable and often contradictory moral landscape of urban poverty and the intricate power dynamics within the projects. Sudhir Venkatesh is an American sociologist born in India and a professor at Columbia University. Don't go away, Hurdley the editor will be right back with the story. In 1989, a young sociology student, Sudhir Venkatesh, arrived at the University of Chicago. His academic curiosity soon led him into the heart of the city's poorest neighborhoods. Armed with a questionnaire and a thirst for knowledge, Sudhir wandered far beyond the university's safe zones, intrigued by the stark contrast between the privileged white students of Hyde Park and the impoverished black communities just across the street. The university had warned him and others not to venture into these dangerous areas. But for Sudhir, it wasn't enough to observe from a distance. One day, during one of his explorations, Sudhir found himself entering a dilapidated high-rise in the Robert Taylor Homes, a notorious housing project in Chicago. The building was dark, the air thick with the smell of urine and despair. As he ascended the stairs, a group of young men surrounded him, questioning his purpose and accusing him of being a spy. Sudhir, overwhelmed but determined, tried to explain that he was there to conduct research. It was in that moment that he met JT, a charismatic and imposing figure who would become a key part of his journey. JT was no ordinary man. He was a leader of the Black Kings, a local gang that controlled much of the drug trade in the area. Despite the initial hostility, JT was amused by the naive graduate student. After some tense exchanges, he decided to let Sudhir observe his world, but on J.T. quote. S terms. In one of their early conversations, JT mocked Sudhir's academic questionnaire. "How does it feel to be black and poor?" JT responded dryly, "I'm not African American either. I'm a nigger." It was a powerful moment, and one that made Sudhir realize how out of touch his academic tools were with the reality of life in the projects. As Sudhir continued to follow JT through the Robert Taylor Homes, he witnessed the daily struggles of the residents, single mothers, hustlers and drug dealers all trying to survive in an environment of extreme poverty and violence. The project wasn't just a place of crime, though. It was also a close-knit community where people looked out for each other, despite the chaos. The walls of the crumbling buildings hid stories of resilience and humanity that went unnoticed by the rest of the city. Sudhir's initial days in the Robert Taylor Homes set the stage for a much deeper exploration. What started as a curiosity about poverty and race soon evolved into an intense personal journey into the complicated lives of the people who lived in the projects. He learned that survival in these areas required more than just money. It required connections, trust, and a constant negotiation of power. This early part of the story challenges our understanding of poverty, particularly in urban America. It's easy to look at housing projects like Robert Taylor and see only crime, but what Sudhir began to uncover was a complex web of relationships, where gangs like the Black Kings filled roles that the government had long abandoned. The gang wasn't just about drugs, it provided protection, income, and even a sense of order in an otherwise chaotic environment. And so, with this introduction to JT and his world, Sudhir's journey deepened. He was no longer just a researcher, he was becoming part of the fabric of the Robert Taylor Homes. As he ventured further into the gang's operations, a more personal connection to JT emerged, leading to his next phase, learning how to navigate life as an apprentice in JT's gang. Sudhir's relationship with JT deepened as he became more embedded in the daily workings of the gang. JT, a man who could navigate the chaos of the Robert Taylor Homes with ease, started to trust Sudhir with insights that outsiders rarely glimpsed. What had begun as a curious academic pursuit turned into an unplanned apprenticeship. Sudhir wasn't just observing anymore, he was living in the world of the Black Kings. One day, JT made an unexpected offer. He asked Sudhir to play the role of gang leader for a day. JT said, "You want to know what it's like? You think you're ready?" With that, Sudhir found himself thrust into the position of managing the gang's activities. He quickly learned that being a leader meant more than controlling the drug trade. It meant dealing with the endless stream of requests from residents, resolving disputes, and balancing delicate relationships with the police, who either ignored the projects or harassed its residents. Sudhir saw firsthand how much JT was responsible for. On the surface, it seemed like JT's power came from fear and intimidation, but it was far more complicated. He was not only the enforcer, but also the mediator between the gang and the community. His authority rested on his ability to maintain peace within the chaos. As the day wore on, Sudhir struggled with the relentless demands for protection, the constant flow of money, and the expectations of everyone from tenants to fellow gang members. It wasn't as glamorous as it looked from the outside. Gang leadership required endless patience, cunning, and nerves of steel. In the midst of this, Sudhir met Miss Bailey, a sharp, elderly tenant leader who knew how to work the system. She wasn't part of the gang, but she held just as much power in her own way. Miss Bailey had long understood that the key to survival was knowing who to trust and when to turn a blind eye. She and JT had an unspoken agreement. He handled the streets, she managed the tenants, and together they maintained an uneasy peace. Miss Bailey once told Sudhir, "You can't always fight with the devil. Sometimes you have to dance with him." She ran the housing project like a general, ensuring that order was kept while also playing her own game of survival. Through her, Sudhir learned that the gang wasn't the only source of authority in the Robert Taylor homes. There were layers of informal leadership that operated in the shadows. By now, Sudhir understood that the Black Kings weren't just about drugs and crime. They played a role in stabilising the community, albeit in their own harsh way. JT wasn't just a criminal. He was a leader who provided a form of structure in a world where the official systems of law and order had failed. People came to him for jobs, protection, and even basic necessities, things the government had long ceased to provide. Sudhir's brief experience as a gang leader opened his eyes to the sheer complexity of life in the projects. Gangs were often seen as the problem, but he realised they were, in part, a response to an even bigger problem: the absence of a functioning system to protect and support the residents. As he spent more time with JT and Miss Bailey, he saw how survival in the projects was an intricate dance, one where alliances and power dynamics shifted constantly. This chapter in Sudhir's journey was not just about gaining knowledge. It was about realising how deeply intertwined the community and the gang were. The lines between good and bad blurred, and he began to understand that for many in Robert Taylor, the gang was both a protector and a predator. And as JT's operations grew larger, Sudhir sensed that things were about to change. The fragile balance between survival and destruction was tipping, and what came next would reveal the deeper cracks in the system. This brings us to the next part of the story, where Sudhir's observations take a darker turn as he witnesses the slow unravelling of the world JT and others had fought so hard to keep in balance. As the 1990s progressed, Sudhir began to notice subtle but dangerous shifts in the Robert Taylor homes. The tension that had always simmered beneath the surface was growing more volatile. JT was still running the Black Kings, but the streets were getting rougher and the gangs were becoming more fractured. Police presence increased, not to protect the residents, but to crack down on the drug trade. Yet, their corruption and brutality often made life worse for the people living in the projects. Sudhir found himself caught in the middle, watching as the fragile balance JT had maintained began to crumble. One night, a violent confrontation between JT's gang and the police erupted, leaving several people injured and one young man dead. The incident shook the community to its core, sparking outrage not just at the gang, but at the entire system that had failed them. The police were known to be heavy-handed, often shaking down dealers for money or drugs, but this time it had gone too far. In the chaos, Sudhir saw the delicate web of relationships between the gangs, the residents, and the authorities unraveling. At the same time, the city's plans to demolish the Robert Taylor homes were moving forward. By 1995, many of the buildings were slated for destruction, leaving residents with few options. Despite promises of better housing and safer neighbourhoods, most families were left in limbo, pushed from one decaying building to another, or sent into equally troubled areas. The Stay Together gang was born out of this desperation, a group of residents who tried to hold their community together in the face of displacement and uncertainty. But the odds were stacked against them. Without proper government support or real opportunities for upward mobility, most were forced back into the same cycles of poverty and violence. JT too was feeling the pressure. His once thriving operation was faltering, and his control over the Black Kings was slipping. The demolition of the housing project meant losing not just his base of power, but his income, his influence, and his identity. As the buildings came down, so did the world he had built. Sudhir watched as JT struggled to adapt, knowing that the streets were changing and that survival would require a new strategy, one that he wasn't sure JT could find. For Sudhir, this period was a turning point. He began to reflect on his own role in the community, realizing that his presence, while informative, was ultimately temporary. He could leave whenever he wanted, but for the people of Robert Taylor, there was no easy way out. The collapse of the projects revealed the deep cracks in the system, gaps in housing, education, employment, and policing that left the poor trapped in a cycle with no real escape. Sudhir had seen firsthand how the gangs filled those gaps, providing structure and income where the government had failed. But the destruction of the Robert Taylor homes exposed how fragile that structure really was. As the final building came down, Sudhir's time in the projects came to an end. He left with a deep understanding of the complexities of urban poverty, how crime, violence, and survival were all tied to the systemic failures of a city that had abandoned its poorest citizens. The people of Robert Taylor weren't just victims of gang violence. They were victims of a system that had set them up to fail. In the end, Sudhir's journey through the Robert Taylor homes wasn't just about understanding gang life. It was about witnessing the collapse of a community that had been neglected for too long. The people who lived there had built lives, families, and networks of support in the face of overwhelming adversity. But without real change, without real opportunities, those lives were doomed to be broken apart, just like the walls of the projects. When a curious outsider steps into the world of gangs, corruption, and urban poverty, they uncover a complex web of survival strategies. Gangs like the Black Kings aren't just criminals. They provide jobs, protection, and a sense of order where the system has failed. Corruption blurs the lines between authority and crime, as even the police exploit the community. Survival depends on navigating these power dynamics, compromising and making tough choices when every institution, even the government, seems designed to keep you trapped. As the editor of Herdley, through learning all of the above, we might realize that the future lies not in blaming those trapped in the cycle, but in dismantling the systems that perpetuate it. In the end, Sudhir Venkatesh's journey through the Robert Taylor homes brings us back to the critical point: the unpredictable moral landscape of urban poverty and the intricate power dynamics within the projects. What seemed like a simple dichotomy between gangs and law-abiding citizens was anything but. One memorable story that captured this complexity was when Sudhir witnessed JT negotiating with a local police officer who regularly accepted bribes. The cop, far from being a symbol of law and order, was just another player in the game, demanding a cut of the drug profits in exchange for turning a blind eye to the gang's activities. Sudhir was stunned to see how the very people meant to protect the residents were complicit in their exploitation. "This ain't about right or wrong," JT explained. "It's about surviving, even if you got to pay the ones supposed to be catching you." This episode underscores how deeply the system was broken and how survival often meant compromising with those who held power, whether gang leaders or corrupt cops. Through these observations, Venkatesh doesn't just present a story of poverty or crime. He invites us to reflect on the systems that trap people in those cycles. The world of Robert Taylor Holmes wasn't merely a failing community, but a reflection of larger societal failures. In closing, the book teaches us that addressing urban poverty requires more than just surface-level interventions. It demands a deep rethinking of the structures that allow such exploitation to thrive.